Again, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me, also the people online. I see, I appreciate it very much. One of our presenters is also online already, which is quite good, so they can complete. Good morning, everybody. My name is Cornelia Ulbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Development and Peace at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And I'm very much honored to chair this panel this morning with the title, What's the Matter? The New Materialities of War. It's, as the whole conference, and I think you were already debating about it yesterday quite lively, I guess. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you and follow your discussions, but it's another turning point in history now, and this is why we meet here in Hamburg, and thanks a lot to the organizers of this conference for undertaking this real effort to bring us together here. And I already heard there are people from all over Germany and also from other countries, sometimes online as one of our presenters here. It's another turning point, at least in European history, but it's not the only one, because more than 3 decades ago, we already met as a discipline after the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We celebrated the 33rd anniversary just 2 days ago. And almost over 3 decades ago, it was also a time that the discipline of international relations gathered and asked itself, what didn't we notice? Why were we so bad in predicting the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War? I guess you already debated about it. And at that point, some also said it's the end of the history. It's Francis Fukuyama. I'm sorry, he gets quoted all the time nowadays. But history went on. And in contrast to 3 decades ago, when a war ended, a Cold War ended, now we're talking about the beginning of an aggression of a country, Russia, that was quite instrumental in ending the Cold War. And now again, we're asking ourselves, why didn't we realize, why didn't we interpret the signs on the wall in that way that now we're quite astonished about Russia waging war against Ukraine. And also we're quite astonished about the resistance of Russia in this war. So our panel today will talk about matter, materialities of war. And it's interesting from which angles our 4 presenters tackle this question of what's the matter now. And I welcome here Antje Nötzold. She's a senior researcher and lecturer at the chair of international politics at Chemnitz University of Technology. And I welcome Daniel Lambach. He's a Heisenberg Fellow at the Research Center of Normative Orders at the University of Frankfurt. Also, very warm welcome. He didn't have to travel far. It's Delf Rothe. He's researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, IFSH, at the University of Hamburg. And last but not least, online, I welcome very much André. She's a PhD student at the Department of War Studies and a research assistant at the Center for Science and Security Studies at King's College London. And last but not least, I welcome André as our discussant. He also didn't have to travel far. He's a senior research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies here in Hamburg. So without further ado, because we only have 90 minutes and we are asked to end the session on time. So I give Antje Nötzold the floor now. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to come here to this very interesting conference. And I try to be brief, as we only have little time of the session. So I'm discussing about the dimension of space in the war and its implications for policy, politics, and IR. And I will not present a finalized paper. I really have a discussion paper, so it's just a basis to being developed. And what I want to present are there have been 3 space-related military incidents in the first months of the war in Ukraine. And so first of all, I want to present briefly what happened and their respective significance for the cause of war. And then at the end, I will close with some resulting thoughts and also open questions for discussion with regard to the existing state of the art of the IB and open questions. So the first incident we saw was just an hour before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had a cyber attack from Russia, which led to the failure of a satellite network operated by Viasat. This had huge effects all over Europe. We had the cutoff of nearly 15,000 internet subscribers all over Europe. We had what was gone through German press. We had the German wind turbine manufacturer Enercon, which had no longer control and access to over 5,000 of its wind turbines. But first and foremost, among the clients of these disabled services had been the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian government, the service sector, and other government agencies. So here we see the military importance of this space effect and the utilization of military operations on Earth, which is, first of all, it's nothing new to use this area of space for military aspects. What you've seen here, it was not only an attack against an object in space, it was a connection between the cybersphere and the space sphere. And so we see that the space could be utilized for military purposes in corporate of the cyber perspective. So space and cybersecurity are more and more interconnected as space is becoming a part of the broader digital infrastructure. This had several implications, or we can see several implications. So on the one hand, we see that armed conflict and space and cyberspace will be more and more, become more interdependent and work as critical enablers to connect and synchronize not only systems, but also weapons together on the battlefield. So we have a clear connection to military action. And it's also difficult for IR to conceptualize, define a cyber attack on a space system. And it's already hard to define what is a cyber attack, what are space systems, so even getting it interconnected will be a hard question for IR. On the other hand, we have also implications with regard of the rapidly expanding commercial space sector, the so-called new space, which generates new security risks. So these new space companies, which are not making space not anymore exclusively state domain, they are generally more communicative and share more information. And also we have more and more objects in space, which we have kind of virtually exploiting number of commercial satellites, and also their growing importance for strategic aspects of the economy and the functioning of critical infrastructure. And this offers endless vulnerabilities and potential targets for cyber attacks. We saw a second space-related aspect in the war, and it was a consequence of the cyber attack. And this highlights the expanding influence of new state actors in the area of the outer space. So what we see that after the satellite and the communication system went down, we had a quite unconventional move. The Ukrainian information minister, Fedorov, appeared to Elon Musk via Twitter to provide connection to SpaceX, the SpaceX satellite network. And here these non-state actors reacted very quickly, and the first Starlink terminals were operated in Ukraine just on February 28th, so just a few days after the attack started. We saw also quite unconventional public-private partnership with 5,000 terminals were provided through the USAID and SpaceX. So during the months, thousands of Starlight terminals, also provided by European airlines, allowed the Ukrainian government, officials, strategic companies, and civilians in areas under attack to have still internet connectivity and data access. And additionally, it was not so well known, Microsoft also had provided licenses and service for Ukraine to move critical software services to cloud solutions. So we have seen that the equipment of Starlight had proven to be very effective also in the course of the war. At a tactical level, Starlink is a crucial tool for troops and commanders to remain in contact, to control drones using Starlink to attack Russian forces on the battlefield, and also to develop a live digital map to monitor Russian movements and so to conduct strikes. what is one of the implications we see that we've seen this in the movement of the war, that it demonstrated us that the sovereign and protected satellite communication capabilities are essential to ensure strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. It also shows us that Ukraine, as a non-space country, is completely dependent on foreign space assets in this war. And also we've seen that global tech companies played a significant role in this field. It's even called to have been a pivotal in tipping the balance of power in this conflict. So we see them also as potential future geopolitical actors, which can have effect on the dynamics of war. A third space-related issue we've seen touches directly the military field and concerns the use of hypersonic weapons in Ukraine. According to its own data, Russia has twice employed its new Kinzhal hypersonic missile at the end of March 2022. So it was the first nation to use these new hypersonic weapons in combat. They have also tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic cruise missile called Zircon in May, and in August they announced that they had deployed fighter jets with Kinzhal hypersonic weapons in the Kaliningrad region as part of an additional strategic defense measure. What are the practical implications on these hypersonic weapons? So for Russia, on the one hand, they could have practical military applications, as they are capable or can be used against a variety of potential targets and have the ability to overcome enemy's air defense systems. Kinzhal is also further said to be used possibly to destroy satellites in the lower orbit, meaning those kinds of new space satellites. On the other hand, they are part of a hedging strategy. So they can provide a new way to overcome US missile defense, and so they are intended to strengthen Russia's strategic position from Russian side. So Russia is also using these hypersonic weapons to promote its narrative that it has to divorce itself against the Western aggression and expansion. So the deployment of Kinzhal missile in Ukraine was, but foremost, a symbolic value rather than on practical relevance, as we've seen it only twice. It's a new weapon, it's a very costly weapon, and Russian army has also other arsenal of air-to-ground missiles. But here Putin is trying to limit or even stop Western engagement in Ukraine with the help of uncertainty about this reaction, as it used it with its nuclear threats. Especially as we find a quote that Putin itself has described Kinzhal, designed to be launched from a fighter jet, as an ideal weapon. The scientific assessment with regard to the importance of hypersonic weapons for warfare varies. So on the one hand, their value is quite question critical. So the technology itself is not a game changer, and its clear added military value against existing system remains unclear. However, they are harder to stop than conventional missiles. So as Kunatova put it, missile defense is hard, but hypersonic defense is harder. So there are also some positive attributes to these weapons. They can evade enemy aircraft missile defense and reach targets with high precision. So some even say they are one of the disruptive technologies used in warfare alongside with technologies as IA and autonomous systems. However, there's a high level of sophistication required, and there are also costly developments, so they will remain a niche capacity. But the United States, China, and Russia, as the three peer competitors in this field, will nevertheless most likely continue to develop these offensive hypersonic capabilities, which could be deployed with nuclear weapons. So, as Russia also first deployed these weapons in warfare, they present a potential nuclear-tipped capability. And a nuclear-capable glider is still a weapon system that is capable of delivering nuclear warheads. So out of these three space-related developments, I see some general questions for IB research, for further research, and also for its technical scope. So first, we have to address the question, what kind of regulation in governments in space is needed? Could we have a comparison with the regime for the sea? Is it applicable and useful? Are there any foreseeable goals and promises on which the whole international community could still agree with regard to space? We only have the Outer Space Treaty, which is from the 1960s, and it's quite outdated. We also see outer space as an area of conflict and competition, but also of control and utilization of space. So it has to be incorporated in geopolitical and conflict analysis, as space will be an essential part for new technologies and also important for the military dimension. Third aspect we should address in formal research is how can the massive power shifts from states to non-state actors in space can be taken into account. During Cold War times, space activities were an exclusive zone not only for states but rather for superpowers. In current times, we see not only more and more states being active in developing space programs and a new race to the Mars, not between Russia and US, but between US and China. We also see that there are new geopolitical rivalry in these times. We have commercial actors that are at least equal to the state actors in space. And last but not least, we have seen that tech companies have emerged as important actors in influencing conflict dynamics. They have intervened until now only on a far ad hoc basis, dependent sometimes on only one person's decision, without a clear strategic planning or capacity, and maybe not even fully anticipating the potential unintended negative sides of their actions. So how can we ensure that these companies engage with their power on the right side and meet with wider geopolitical responsibilities in both peace and war times? So with these very broad and very challenging questions, I would finish my presentation and hopefully take the time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I forgot to explain how we will proceed, because we will have all the presentations first and then André will comment on it. So don't be you are allowed to ask questions.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Cornelia, and thanks everyone for turning out this early. I want to pick up a point that Nicole Deitloff made in yesterday's discussion, that many theoretical paradigms have something useful to offer on the Russian invasion. And my question is, how can we leverage that for better analysis rather than engaging into paradigm debates? And my suggestion is that we could do with bridging concepts. And in my paper, I offer space as a way of doing that, not outer space, as Antje was doing, but space in a more conceptual sense. So very briefly, space is about sizes, about shapes, about boundedness, how objects and actors relate to each other in terms of proximity and distance. And there are different ways of conceptualizing spaces, spatial ontologies, such as territory or place or network or landscape. And if you're at all interested in that, I wrote an entire article about it, but I'm not going to go into that. My point is, spaces are not naturally occurring phenomena. That's pretty much the consensus in the recent literature. They are constructed, actively constructed, and maintained through social action. But they also have effects. So we have a co-constitutive relationship of society and space. And this is what I mean by space. It focuses on how spaces are made and remade in social interaction. So my hope is that a spatial approach would not only facilitate discussions within IR, but also with other social scientific disciplines who have also done very interesting work on Ukraine and Russia. Now, how could such a conversation centered around the spatial perspective look like? I would offer three different conceptions of space as analytical lenses, which then can be brought into conversation with each other. First, there's space as physical environment. So geographical factors influence where and how the war is fought. Through factors like terrain, distance, environmental conditions. Proximity and mobility are important factors in force allocation, and logistics as are topographical features like rivers. Second, space as idea and discourse. So what actors think about the space, how they speak about it, how they imagine it, all shapes how they act in relation to it. So this refers to symbols, to representations like maps, as you see here, stories, narratives, other forms of collective imaginaries, all of which matter not only by influencing action, but also by justifying particular kinds of action. And third, there's space as political construction, so projects and practices of political power that are expressed in spatial terms. So this might refer to spheres of influence, expressed in ideas like the Russian Miro Broad, or Novorossiya, or the Commonwealth of Independent States, but we could also look at the separatist republics or independent republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, or the Republic of Crimea as political constructors of space. Importantly, these don't exist independent of each other, but refer to each other, are connected, are intermingled. So ideas of space draw on environmental features, political constructions shape the environment, their designs, and ideas legitimize spatial political projects. And this is basically where the paper concludes. But I want to use the rest of my time to illustrate this. With an example, there are many possibilities from the war, and I want to focus on the Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge, connecting Crimea to mainland Russia. This is the bridge. It consists of two parts. One is a 4-lane road, and one is a double-track railway. The construction began in February 2016, so after the annexation of Crimea. The road bridge was inaugurated in May 2018, so only 2 years later, inaugurated by President Putin himself. And the rail bridge was opened in December 2019. 19 kilometers long, making it the longest bridge in Europe. So it's quite an engineering feat, constructed in a very short time. The significance of it is that it connects the Kerch Peninsula of Crimea to the Taman Peninsula in the Krasnodar region of Russia. Now, on October 8th, in the early morning at about 6 a.m., an explosion occurred on or under the road bridge, which collapsed 2 of the tracks. It also set a passing train on fire, which was carrying fuel. I think about 7 wagons were caught in the explosion. And there were reports that 4 people were killed. Notably, this explosion occurred on the day after Vladimir Putin's 70th birthday. So probably not a coincidence. The remaining road, these 2 tracks, was reopened for light traffic within a few days. The railway line too, once the track was cleared. However, lorries have had to use the ferry service again since then, and repairs have begun the rest. Now, the source of the explosion isn't entirely clear. Russia says it was a lorry carrying explosives. Western sources say it was a maritime drone. So we're a bit in the dark here. But it's pretty clear that this was a Ukrainian operation, even though Ukrainian sources have never formally claimed responsibility for that. Now, let's look at this through the 3 lenses. First of all, in terms of physical environment, the geography of Crimea makes resupply there very difficult, both in civilian and in military terms, if you don't control the area to the north. So this was true for the period of 2014 to 2021. And in 2022, Crimea became an important conduit for the southern Russian flank for the military operations there. So the idea of the bridge was to reduce the leverage of Kiev over transport to Crimea and make Russian supply of the peninsula easier and cheaper. In terms of transport, the bridge was very efficient, much better than the ferry service it had relied on before that. So especially in the summer, traffic could go as high as 20,000 cars a day. And the lorry throughput was increased by about a factor of 3. So this was a very useful piece of infrastructure. It also represented something of a blockade of the Kerch Strait, cutting off access to the Azov for the Ukrainian Navy, or at least reducing its ability to move. So an attack on the bridge has a clear military rationale. It also communicates a capability to conduct operations deep in Russian territory. Secondly, political constructions. Infrastructures are performances of territoriality, I would say. So the bridge symbolically integrates Crimea into Russia. It mitigates the exclave character of Crimea from a Russian perspective. The degree to which the bridge helped normalize Russian control over Crimea becomes visible in the presence of Russian tourists on holiday in Crimea. So this is from a report 2018, where the Ministry of Economic Development of the Republic of Crimea reported that the number of tourists in Crimea had been rising after the opening of the bridge, because it's just become more accessible. And the tourism continued even while the war was going on. You might have seen these Ukrainian propaganda posts fleeing Russian tourists after attacks on a Russian airbase in August 2022, where the bridge was clogged up with traffic from all these Russians leaving the peninsula. And thirdly, the bridge was also symbolically important. I didn't mention the engineering feat that was accomplished there. It also has some historical resonance. This wasn't the first attempt at building something across the strait. So at the inauguration, Vladimir Putin said in different historical epochs, even under the Tsar priests, people dreamed of building this bridge. So it was commemorated on a postage stamp, but that's kind of boring. So we would focus on particularly juicy bit of propaganda. The movie, The Crimean Bridge Made with Love, was a 2018 Russian state-funded film. The script was written by Margarita Simonyan, which most of you will know, as sort of the chief propagandist of the regime on Russia Today. And it was directed by her husband. An editorial by Radio Free Europe likened the movie to Mamma Mia if it had been made by the Soviet Union. It's really quite bonkers. I want to quote extensively from Wikipedia because the entry there is quite funny. So as for the plot, because I know you want to know, the plot, the Crimean Bridge is being built in Kerch. Two men at the construction site are pursuing an archaeology student named Vadia. Victor, a PR man from Moscow, who arrives in a white convertible with an American television crew, and Dima, a young and ambitious builder. Sadly, Wikipedia doesn't tell us how the movie ends. I have my suspicions. I suspect you have my money on Dima. But it goes on to say something about the reception. The film attracted scathing reviews. It flopped at the box office. Cinemas in Kazakhstan refused to screen this film. So that's quite a ride. It's quite interesting. And notably, there were also allegations that Simonyan used the film to embezzle millions of rubles through her production company. So all in all, propaganda is quite something magical, isn't it? Okay, that's all. I hope that I could demonstrate how space, in different ways of looking at space, can help us sort of illuminate different parts of the conflict, but also bring together these different strands of analysis. So in my reading, the attack on the Kerch Bridge was effective because it was important by disrupting military logistics, by demonstrating Ukrainian capabilities, but also by destroying the symbol of Crimean integration into Russia. Okay, that's all. If you want to learn more, visit my website, hit me up afterwards, and I look forward to it.
Get you share the screen again?
Yes, please. Just share the screen and
So your presentation. No, I just put it onto the computer. It's on this.
Zeitenende.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Thanks so much for the invitation and for the perfect organization of the conference, which is such an effort. So huge thanks. Yeah, my talk is on the not on the Zeitenwende, but on the Zeitenende. So the idea that this one moment might not be so much a turning point, but it might even be an end point of sort of human history. At least there are people out here. And so the main point that I sort of want to make in the short paper is that sort of the Russian invasion of Ukraine requires us to rethink how climate security is approached and studied in IR and beyond. And sort of this claim starts from the observation that the Ukraine war and climate change are closely interlinked in many complex ways. I've probably heard that as we're today, national leaders and delegations are coming together in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for the 20th edition of the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. And it's fair to say that this year's COP is clearly overshadowed by the events in the Ukraine. So on the second day of the high-level event of the COP, President Zelensky delivered a video speech in which he stressed that there can be no effective climate policy without peace. And he stressed in his speech how the war has led to a revival of coal and fossil fuels in many European countries. And he stressed the environmental impacts of Russia's war in the Ukraine. And on the left, not on the right side on this image, you can see that there's also a Ukrainian pavilion now on display at the COP. So for the first time in the history of the COP, Ukraine has its own pavilion. And there were many other leaders, like Joe Biden yesterday, who would stress sort of these interlinkages between the war and climate change. And I think one could cluster these interlinkages into three main themes. First, the security implications of sort of extractivism and fossil fuels dependency. The European dependence on Russian gas is also in part due to the sort of previous decarbonization strategy of the EU, right? Where natural gas was seen as a bridging technology as part of the mitigation strategy of the EU, basically leading into this current situation. Where European countries are effectively sort of funding both sides in this war. Second, Russia's war highlights of the ecological cost of war and militarization. After all, sort of the war is a massive waste of energy and sort of greenhouse gases for nothing but mere destruction. And at the same time, sort of there's this growing recognition of the tremendous carbon cost of the military, even sort of in peacetime. And thirdly, the war points to the complex global entanglements between multiple crises and resulting security risks. So one example is the Russian blockade of grain and fertilizer exports in the Black Sea, which is feared to have certain knock-on effects on human security in other world regions, right? And this is sort of reinforced by climate change, which has repeatedly caused droughts in other grain exporting countries like India over the past couple of years, right? So there's this growing acknowledgement of these sort of complex global entanglements, even in the political discourse. The point I make in the paper then is sort of that the existing literature on climate change and security is ill-equipped to grasp these sort of complex interlinkages. And there's several reasons for this. And importantly, sort of climate security really very much as for sort of causality and sort of preoccupied with the question of climate change as a causal factor in violent conflict. And even after 30 years of research, there are no clear results. So we have studies who show a sort of causal influence. There are others who show that there is no connection. So as there is a sort of consent that climate change will unlikely cause major interstate wars, the focus is very much sort of on intrastate conflict and sort of low intensity violence. And there is sort of a systemic review of the literature by Adams et al., which has shown a problematic sort of empirical bias or streetlight effect, which is studies focused predominantly on already unstable and conflict-prone contexts in Africa. And so what is actually measured in these studies, according to the authors, is not so much the impact of climate change, but rather sort of the repercussions of European colonialism in these countries. And this is sort of echoed by critiques of the strong focus on, resource scarcity and climate-induced migration, as two main causal mechanisms in the debate. And critical scholars have argued that this focus is due to ingrained colonial stereotypes, neo-Malthusian narratives of, populations in the global South, overusing their resources. So, and in the paper, I then go to review sort of this emerging literature on security and geopolitics in the Anthropocene to identify possible alternatives to these perspectives. So we did this textbook on AI in the Anthropocene, which was published last year, and there we refer to the Anthropocene as a condition we're in, rather than as an external set of problems that we're confronted with, like climate change or extreme weather. Right? Now, in this emerging literature, there are several sort of competing discourses or perspectives that try to make sense of this new condition. And then in the paper, I distinguished three such perspectives and discuss how they help making sense of the Ukraine war, which is obviously sort of rather speculative or explorative. So the first is what I've termed planetary realism elsewhere. So there's not a lot of talk about the return of realism. So in the context of the Anthropocene, there is a new form or new type of realism, which has its roots in the Cold War, concretely in nuclear realism of the 1950s, of concerned natural scientists like Einstein or Bertrand Russell and others. And then sort of the GIGA hypothesis, which was developed by Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock in the 1970s. And this idea of the Earth as sort of a single, interconnected, self-organizing system. And then after the end of the Cold War, all this fed sort of into Earth system science, which is now sort of the dominant scientific paradigm, I would say, and the natural sciences, or in the Earth, geosciences. And then sort of philosophers like Bruno Latour and others would draw on this idea to stress that the human's earth-boundedness as an ethical position. So humans would have to accept their dependence on and entanglement with a dynamic Earth system, which is beyond their control. Right? Now, in IR, this sort of perspective has been adopted to promote a cosmopolitan sort of understanding of security, which has sort of the entangled Earth system as its core reference object. Right, and Tony Burke and others most prominently pushed this perspective in the Planet Politics Manifesto. I think this quote nicely summarizes this trope. So, from a planetary realist perspective, then the Russian attack on Ukraine is a threat to global security, not only because it means a massive waste of energy and CO2 emissions, but also because it sort of strengthens nationally defined understandings of security and diminishes the prospects of international cooperation. So if the war leads to renewed global arms race, this would create a new kind of security dilemma, according to this perspective. A tragic situation where short-term security needs conflict with sort of long-term security implications of the global ecological crisis. But I argue that as an ethical perspective, planetary realism also suffers from an inherent flaw. And this is, from the perspective of the Earth system, it makes no difference whether CO2 emissions are produced by Russian tanks or by Ukrainian air defense missiles, right? So Gaia doesn't care about sort of human-made constructs like sovereignty claims. So by collapsing humankind into sort of a single collective actor, it limits the normative and analytical value to make sense of this current crisis, in my opinion. The second discourse that I discussed was on Delf Rothe's notion of the Eurocene instead. And sort of Rothe points this label to stress that the Anthropocene is not produced by the whole humankind, but actually sort of is the product of European colonial warfare. So according to him, the Eurocene is best understood sort of as a 500-year-long project of ecological transformation and terraforming by means of collective violence. Crucial for his argument is the reading of warfare as ecology, as a lively and emergent assemblage that works on and through nature. And I would argue that Rothe's sort of theoretical perspective is helpful because it allows to theorize sort of the invasion of Ukraine as a form of imperial ecological warfare. I mean, Rothe, as a left US academic, is very much focused, obviously, on Europe and the US, tracing a continuity from the colonization of the Americas to the current US drone warfare program. However, I think this perspective could be extended to Russia and the Soviet Union as well, because during the Cold War, both superpowers were equally involved in the colonization of nature, right? The Soviet Union built on a highly modernist vision of controlling nature by technical means, for example, through a so-called peaceful nuclear explosions, to terraform Soviet territory, or through weather modification technologies. So current forms of Russian ecological warfare could be seen as a continuation or revival of sort of these earlier forms of Soviet modernism. And then the third perspective that I discuss understands the Anthropocene as sort of a hyper-extractivist or extractivist age, right? So according to this view, the current crisis is not caused by the whole humanity, but by fossil fuels capitalism and its underlying model of resource extractivism. And then due to the immense grievances produced by the system, it has to be violently protected in many places around the globe. And then Timothy Mitchell has prominently argued that sort of the emergence of liberal democracies in the global north is based on the extraction of fossil fuels, and this is systematically linked to various forms of carbon authoritarianism in the global south, right? And then finally, extractivism isn't backed not only politically and economically, but also culturally by what Derek calls a culture of petromasculinity. And she looks at Trumpism in the US to trace what she calls a catastrophic convergence between a fossil capitalist system under pressure, climate denialism, and rising authoritarian desire. And I think there is evidence of a similar catastrophic convergence in Russia as well. Of course, I'm no regional expert, but I found evidence in the literature of sort of a simultaneous rise of authoritarianism, dependence on resource trends, climate denialism and sort of state-controlled media, and masculinist discourse in Russia since 2010. So basically since Putin returned to office. And of course, this did not cause the Ukraine war. It would be crazy to argue that, but it created an environment in which sort of the invasion became sort of possible and more likely to think, right? And sort of by way of conclusion, I argue that we need to get away from climate security as a quest for causality and focus on the already happening violence around the globe. We need to talk about carbon authoritarianism, extreme polarization and radicalization happening, not in East Asia, not in Africa, but right here in Europe and in the US. Right? We need to talk much more about political economy. I mean, I think you probably support that claim, but the risk of lock-ins and dependencies, supply chains of renewable energies, for example. Or what happens in countries in the Middle East when economic rents from fossil fuels sort of collapse. And then sort of finally, we need to account for complexity and non-linearity and sort of look for methodologies as well that draw on the combination of innovative methods like satellite remote sensing in combination with maybe more participatory or creative approaches That would be my proposal, and I leave it here. And many thanks for your attention.
Hello, can you hear me and see my slides? Hello? Hi, sorry. Can you hear me and see my slides all right? Yes. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, and also for the introduction. I'm a researcher mostly on nuclear security, but also nuclear safety. So I mostly look at nuclear power plants and how they can be kept safe. And of course, there was a lot to talk about during Ukraine, and I thought it might be interesting to share that here as well about mostly Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So I was going to go through a little bit of what the conflict meant for nuclear security and how we originally looked at legal and physical protection of nuclear power plants. But I also want to go into what that means for Germany and the world, and what we should think about this in the future maybe, and how we can not miss this again. So to get everyone onto the same page, I think it's important to look at Ukraine before the war, because Ukraine was a bit of a unique situation. They had a lot of nuclear reactor units, 15, that were still online. They produced about 55% of the country's energy, which is a huge share in comparison to Germany in particular. The reactors were pretty old, from the 70s and 80s, so they were inherited from the Soviet Union. Most of the ones that were still online were not RBMK designs, which are quite notorious for the Chernobyl incident, but they're different types of so-called VVER designs. And most of them are also very close to population centers. So apart from Chernobyl, all of them are actually really close to very big cities. And I think two sites have been a particular focus since February. Chernobyl on the one hand, which has 4 units that are all decommissioned and 1 reactor that is melted down. It hosts more than 20,000 fuel assemblies that are either already cooled down or they're still in the cooling process. And then Zaporizhzhia, the second site, since kind of March, has 6 units, and the press never fails to mention that it's the largest in Europe. It has more than 2,000 tons of spent fuel on site. We don't know how much exactly, because it's usually not declared, but that's kind of a rough estimate. It's certainly more than 2,000 tons. And during the war, we saw a lot of breaches of the security in Chernobyl as well as Zaporizhzhia. Both of them were occupied at some point. First Chernobyl on the first day of the invasion, and later Zaporizhzhia in March. And after that, a lot of breaches of security happened, and during as well. So we saw first at Chernobyl a termination of data transmission. So usually all the radiological data is transmitted to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, but that ceased as soon as the plant was occupied and was only kind of reinstated partially. We saw a lot of shelling at Zaporizhzhia and at Chernobyl, which, for example, caused the fire station at Zaporizhzhia to move to the nearby city, and therefore really prolonged emergency response time in case there is a fire. We also saw that Russia has installed itself kind of like a military base at Zaporizhzhia. We don't know how many people are there exactly, but the IAEA has confirmed that there are certain areas that are now not available for access for the Ukrainian operators of the plant because there is military personnel stationed there. We also saw a lot of disconnections from the grid. So Zaporizhzhia has 4 energy lines to the grid plus 1 backup, and all of them had been cut at some point, and diesel generators had to pick up the energy for cooling, which always prompted a lot of attention from the press and kind of made people discuss nuclear holocaust and stuff like that again. Then we had kidnappings of staff and staff under extreme pressure. This has been described especially in the IAEA report that's on the right here, which came out in September. And since then, the IAEA has a permanent presence at the plant to sort out what is misinformation and what is real information. So since then, we've kind of have a better overview of what's going on, but it's still a bit tricky to figure out what exactly happened and is happening still. So to look at the legal protection of nuclear power plants, we actually have rules in place for what happens with nuclear power plants in war. It's the Geneva Convention Additional Protocol 1, Article 56, that says that in general nuclear power plants are exempt from attack targeting, but there's already a first if here, which is that if you can avoid a release of material, then technically this kind of protection ceases. And when we continue to section 2 of the protocol, Article 56, then we see that there are even more exemptions. So a nuclear power plant, even though it is exempt from attacks usually, can become the target of attacks legally if it supports the military on a significant and direct base. We know that in Zaporizhia that was probably not the case, but that's probably what Russia would argue if we told them that this is against Article 56 of the protocol. And there's again more ifs, there is more rules for what you can do to terminate the support. There's another rule that says that even if you attack a nuclear power plant, you have to keep in mind the civilian protection, which stands over your right to attack the plant. And you should avoid the release of so-called dangerous forces, which in this case is radiation. You can also not use a nuclear power plant as a bargaining chip in war, so it can't become a pawn of war. And you should not station any military equipment at the plant. So that's certainly something that we see violated in this case. You can make additional agreements to protect the plant. That's very much welcome. And maybe as a last fun fact about legal protection of nuclear power plants, because I didn't know that either, but if you want to protect your nuclear power plant, in addition, you can mark it with 3 orange circles, which identifies as a nuclear power plant in warfare. I haven't seen this being done in Ukraine, to be honest, but it's not a must because the protection doesn't cease because you didn't do that. But it's just interesting that that is an additional marking that you can put on your power plant to protect it. So that was kind of the legal side, but there's also physical rules for how to protect nuclear power plants. But I can say already they're not made for war. So the protection is not intended to be against warfare. Because they're on the one hand the IAEA safety standards, which is kind of the idea that you have to protect nuclear power plants against any kind of natural event. So tsunamis, earthquakes, storms, and also storm missiles. But they explicitly exclude military missiles from their guidelines. So you don't have to build a nuclear power plant with military missile attacks in mind. And the same also applies to the second set of rules for nuclear power plant design, which is the so-called design-based threat, which is supposed to protect nuclear power plants against people that mean harm from the inside and outside. And this is something that we saw a lot in the beginning of the conflict, that experts cited this design-based threat rule and said, oh yeah, nuclear power plants are protected against airplane crashes, so we're fine, we can just shell around the nuclear power plant. But that's certainly not what's meant here, because an airplane is just not the same as a military missile. So just in case that you read that anywhere, that's just a bit of a risky assessment. There are 2 caveats to these rules. The first one is that states implement them themselves. So the IAEA doesn't look at the implementation as such. The member state decides how to implement these rules and which ones to focus on. Because, for example, Japan has to look at earthquakes and tsunamis a lot more than our nuclear power plant, for example, in Bavaria, obviously. So this made sense, but it also means that there's a lot of chaos. There are some power plants that have different design features than others. So this is not like an always applied rule set. And the second problem is that we are uncertain about which of these features are incorporated in the power plants that are currently impacted. So we're not sure, because Zaporizhia is a bit older and some of these designs are retrofitted. We don't know what Zaporizhia is currently featuring. So why is this important for Germany, and why should we even care about this? Because I heard a few times people say, oh yeah, but we're turning off our nuclear power plants, so actually we're fine. Why would we even care? And I think the first reason we should care is because we still have 2 nuclear power plants running. That was in the press quite famously. I mean, we are intending to keep them on at least for a bit longer. And on top of that, people often forget that we have research reactors, which have a smaller inventory. So their uranium fuel rods are a lot smaller and could do less damage if they were hit. But it's still not a good idea to not care about their protection, especially because we have actually just extended their life cycle. For example, this picture on the right shows a nuclear research reactor in the Technische Universität Munich, and they have just signed a new contract with France to supply new fuel rods in 2020. And since we're not intending to turn them off, I think we should care about their protection. And even if that didn't convince you that we should care, our neighbors are actually building nuclear power plants at the moment. There is an increasing trend of reliability on nuclear power, with 55 nuclear power plants approximately under construction at the moment in 15 countries. And these includes neighbor countries such as France and the UK, but also Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, Japan, India, and South Korea. And some of these also export to other countries. So Russia, for example, is currently building a nuclear power plant in Turkey. And we have new reactor designs under development for the future. They might be a bit safer. I can talk about that later if you wish, but just to already take that away, they're not going to be conflict safe in any way. So how did we miss this? I think that in Germany, we didn't really look at the failure to protect nuclear power plants if there is a conflict. And that, I think, has two reasons. The first one is that our nuclear debate in Germany was always focused on kind of the idea of we need to talk about waste, we need to talk about expenses, we need to talk about safety. But we didn't really think about talking about these security measures and that they're insufficient to protect power plants from conflict. But at the same time, we also had a political debate in Germany that kind of neglected the idea that someone would ever dare to shoot at a nuclear power plant. And to be honest, I fell into that trap as well. I kind of couldn't imagine that someone would ever be crazy enough to do this. And I think our focus was always on kind of Friedenspolitik, Wandel durch Handel, all these beautiful ideas that we really subscribe to. But I think we sort of missed out that other people don't subscribe to them and are not a huge fan of protecting nuclear power plants, but I'm more of a fan of kind of realist ideas. So last but not least, what can we do about it? I think as academics and researchers, it's really important that we broaden our horizon so that we start to look at the whole complexity of the issue, which is not just politics, it's also nuclear security. And we need to integrate these both focuses. We need to raise concern about this, and we need to bring in people from kind of fringe debates. So that includes people who have an idea of what's actually going on in Russia and in Putin's mind. I haven't really read a lot of stuff by people written in Russia, people who were taught in Russia and who have a better understanding of their political system. That's a trap that I fell into and that I intend not to fall into again. So we need to read international literature. And I think for policymakers, it's really important that the Zeitenwende isn't just military expenditure and then that's it, but that we have an integration of scientific opinion in a very structured way into political processes. At the moment, it's been done more or less on an ad hoc basis. I think this needs to change. And also we need to refocus on different kind of political ideas and adjust the legal framework, obviously, for nuclear power plant protection in the future. I'm not sure how that can be done. I gave some ideas in the paper, but I'm open for suggestions if anyone here has a background in international law and has an idea of how we can do it. So just to conclude, I think, first of all, we have seen that nuclear infrastructure cannot be protected from conflict, neither physically, nor can it currently be legally protected. We've also seen that the war in Ukraine has demonstrated a lack of political and also possibly scientific urgency for this matter. We haven't really cared about it before the war, I feel. And I think that the Zeitenwende should include a new mindset on those international nuclear issues as well, and not just military issues in the narrow sense of the word. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Also, Amelie, can you hear me fine? Okay. Yeah, thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to this panel, and Cornelia for the organization, and the colleagues for the interesting papers. As you could hear now, those are very interesting papers that have a very broad, an extremely broad range of perspectives. So I'm going to try in the beginning with some short comments, linking them to the topic of the panel. and the panel is called, of course, What's the Matter? The New Materialities of War. And I will address some individual of those elements of the title, and then I will go individually with comments on each of the paper. So as I said, the subject matter of What's the Matter is really broad. Antje's paper on outer space dynamics linked to the Ukraine war, cyber attacks, the role of tech companies, and hypersonic weapon systems. Then Daniel's paper is on a very different kind of level of abstraction, looking into different space-related dynamics, and he presents the kind of model or a kind of analytical framework on how to look at those. Delf then, even on a much more abstract level of abstraction, looking at kind of a global perspective from climate security. And finally, then Amelie, what we've just heard, the issue of the non-protection of nuclear infrastructure in Ukraine, and in the paper much more than in the presentation, she actually focuses on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that has been shelled and also occupied by the Russian army since March 2022. So when you look at the title of the panel, of course, it is about the new materialities of war. But actually, when you zoom in on what is meant by materialities in the different papers, I think they are not, the materiality issue is not actually in the focus of most of the papers so much. Of course, Antje's paper zooms in on these weapon systems and on the satellites, and that is, of course, a very material element, but there is not an explicit discussion about the materiality here. Daniel, in his paper, uses the physical environment in a way as the material form of looking at space, but then he combines it with various other issues. Delf, of course, in his paper, talks about the materiality a little bit towards the end, also in his call right now for a more stronger focus on the political economy side, on the kind of materialities side, and it's kind of floating around, but there's not an explicit discussion of materialities in the paper. And of course, Amelie in her paper talks about nuclear infrastructures in Ukraine and in Germany, about those plans, but again, there's not an explicit discussion of what is meant here. But this is probably not a problem. I think we could just, in a way, reframe the panel and call it the new spatialities of war, because that is what much more the papers are doing from different angles, and we can discuss in which way kind of spatiality and materiality are probably linked. And I'm not going to go through all the papers again, but you've heard yourself how in how many ways space and spatiality is conceptualized very differently. Again, Antje talks about outer space as space here, and a kind of this understanding. Daniel focuses on these spatial lenses. Delf takes a very global planetary kind of perspective of space. And then Amelie zooms in on the space of one power plant, and again, more in the paper than in the presentation. Then, of course, the question about newness or novelty, so the new part, in which, or put differently, what do we know now, or what have we learned from the Ukraine war about spatiality, materiality, that we didn't know before? So here I would say the papers give somewhat different answers, and perhaps none of the papers says there is something completely new that we didn't know before. Probably most, in a way, what Amelie said at the end, that this actual attack of a nuclear power plant and this as being part of war making, that is something new, but I'm going to come back to this issue when I discuss her paper individually. And of course, what some of the other papers suggest is that they zoom in on certain aspects. Antje says, it's the first time that the hypersonic weapons have been used here, and that is some novelty, but I'm wondering, when you discuss it then, in which way this is really a complete game changer. You actually qualify it quite a bit and say that it is something new, but then it is also, it can also be deterred differently, and that it's questionable. But it's a point to discuss, I think. So at least you raise it here. Of course, also in your paper, you talk about the new importance of the tech companies in outer space. But again, the question is it a qualified new, is it completely new? And it comes out a little bit. And there's much less about this newness, I guess, in some of the other papers, even though they try to use both Delf and Daniel, Ukraine war to rethink some of what we had before, but I'm wondering whether we could not have done this also without the Ukraine war. Now let me zoom on the papers individually, and I go by order of the way they have been presented. Antje presents a really interesting paper on focusing on the kind of cyber attack or like kind of the outer space dimension of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and she starts out with the cyber attack like that immediately started before the war. Yeah, I was wondering, as a non-expert on cybersecurity and on this kind of outer space system, you raised the question in the paper on whether to define it or not, but then you kind of move on in the paper. And actually, depending on where you want to publish this or want to submit this, I think it would really be important to have at least a kind of tentative definition of both outer space, especially related when we refer to other papers, how their space concepts are, and also of cyber attacks. My second comment is about the multinational corporations and these companies, Elon Musk is mentioned, and some others. In many ways, what you argue here is that one change to before is that now it's much more known and it's much more communicated about. So it's a much more public issue, the question of the role that they have in outer space. They also brag, Musk brags about this. And I'm wondering whether we could take this communication / new technologies in war and how they have been used, not a little bit more historically. I'm not saying that you have to go with this in the paper, but at least think about how in earlier wars, the question of communication and new media at the time has been used and has been also instrumentalized in warfare. So I'm thinking of the role of radio during the Second World War. I'm thinking of the role of television during the Cold War and some of the hot wars within the Cold War, and probably also the role of satellite TV in the post-Cold War era in wars. And you don't have to do this in this short paper, but probably to think about the relative novelty of these kind of outer space dynamics and the role of satellites here vis-a-vis these other ones. And then finally, my last question, you say that during the Cold War times, space activities were not an exclusive zones for states, but even for superpowers. And of course, you mean the US and the Soviet Union at the time. And of course, there was NASA and it's a state agency and so on. But to me, the question is how already in this historical period, tech companies or non-state actors, as you call them, have been involved in this. So whether not in these earlier periods too, you have this interplay of state and non-state actors. Because right now it comes across as if it's completely different from what we had before, and I'm wondering whether that is actually the case. Okay, let me speed up a bit and move to Daniel's paper. Really well-argued piece, and I really like in the presentation that you brought in this Courage example, because I would have asked you to specify and to kind of play through with the lens that you're suggesting. So it's good that this is done. Another thing I like about the paper, that he's really quoting actually post-Soviet critical geopolitics studies, O'Loughlin, Kuzio, O'Toole, who have worked on this in the past. I think in general at this conference, there are not so many Ukraine-Russia experts, and I think it's actually good to bring in some more research on this before. So this is all fine, and in principle, I can see also how with this materialist ideational approach or linking them of space makes sense. What I don't really get is the concrete differentiation between, on the one hand, space as an idea and discourse, and on the other, space as a political construction. You put them as a triangle, but in many ways, this political construction and the idea and discourse are very much tied. And I'm wondering if you have a material ideational overcoming, why can't you just work with both? And to look at your example of the Kerch Bridge, when you mentioned Simon-Jan as the film producer, now is she a political constructive person who's an opinion maker of this, or does she just draw on older Russian tropes? So to me, where do you draw the line between the space as idea and discourse on the one hand and space as political construction on the other? In the paper, you also say, okay, it's a bit flexible and a bit overlapping and so on. But to me, I wasn't fully convinced by this. And finally, Daniel, how would you study this methodologically? I mean, of course, you can do framing, discourse analysis, and so on. But what else? What other innovative methods you could bring to bear to study this? Moving to Delf's paper, I think a very well-written piece, very interesting ideas floating around, and you talk about very different things in the paper, and that is good because I learned a lot, but it's also not so good because I was looking for the rote Linie, the rote Faden a little bit. And I actually think there are two papers here. The one paper that you start out with in the abstract, in the intro, that talks about the kind of climate security related dimensions of the Ukraine war in a more conventional sense, this fossil fuel background of Russia leading into this, the ecological costs of the war making itself, and then the kind of global ripple effects through the war on other climate related issues, food security, and all of this. So I think one paper, a more conventional paper, could be to fill all this with much more empirical knowledge. But then you make this move, okay, this is the way one could do this with this conventional perspective, and then you do a lit review, and then you go somewhere else. On the lit review, just a small comment, and that's probably because I have this déformation professionnelle from Syria. You say there's a lot of bias about focusing on climate and Africa research. I think there's also quite some research on some other wars, especially Syria, a little bit Yemen also. And I'm wondering if you did this more systematically, you need to provide some more nuance. But that's like a side note. That's not the main point. I think what's more interesting then is when you move towards these Anthropocene-related concepts of planetary realism, colonial warfare / Eurocene, and this extractive age. I think if you focus the paper on this, I would want much, much more empirical illustrations. I would really like you to show that from this very, very abstract theoretical level, how this really informs, or really kind of is linked with empirical political developments, let's say, in Ukraine. On the carbon authoritarianism, something that's not in the paper, but in the presentation, I also think there's a lot to do about this. And again, it would be something kind of linking various regions or regional studies together. Last but not least, Emily's paper, again, on a very different level. Very interesting, very kind of politically very relevant topic, definitely. And in the paper, a bit different from the presentation, you start out with the kind of large surprise that was there in both the political public, but also in political science, about the Russian occupation and the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. For me, to understand better the relative surprise of this surprise, or the relativity of this surprise, it would be good to know about the global empirical landscape of in which nuclear power plants have been parts of war more globally. In the paper, you talk about that Israel destroyed the Iraqi Osirak plant, that during the Iran-Iraq war, there was mutual attacks, on Boucher and Osirak again. But what else? So if where else have we seen destructions or attacks on nuclear power plants? I think it would be good to get this global overview to probably, probably the surprise is coming from the fact that it never happened before. And then the critique of the surprise is probably less urgent. So I think that would help me a little bit. You say also there's almost no legal protection really possible of these attacks because the clauses in the Geneva Convention can be utilized in various ways. But you do speak briefly about response mechanisms. And I would like you just to elaborate a little bit more on what those could be in terms of implementing some of these clauses from the Geneva Convention, operationalizing them. Any suggestions I think would be, interesting for me. And then the last point about for the scholarship, what should be done? And you said, we should be more in the focus. For me, the question, and that's probably because I'm not a classical IR person, but more from comparative politics and area studies, question is IR doing the trick? Or do we actually need to know much more area studies about Russian rationales and legitimizations of doing this? Or do we need actually much more authoritarianism studies, and especially personalist authoritarianism studies from comparative politics? Or do we need them all together? IR, comparative area studies. What is your take on this? And the last point, and then I will close. I know it's already a bit over time. In the paper, you advocate for, and I quote here, a permanent scientific council that is comprised of a diverse set of scholarly voices and must be consulted before policy decisions are made by decision makers, like in Germany on this issue. I'm a bit skeptical about that. So who should be in this permanent scientific council? Is it like in the STIKO, representatives of the how representative and democratic are those? And should this really be the case that some of us potentially can be veto players before political decisions are taken? So I really want to provoke you a bit on this last point, and with this I close, and I thank very much all the papers.
Thanks a lot for all the inspiring presentations and for the excellent comments of André. He had it quite hard because there was so much in the paper, and his comments took a bit longer than we assumed. But I would like to give you the opportunity to, I would like to collect 2 or 3 questions, and then, because for the sake of time, and I would like to have to give the presenters the opportunities to react to the comments and your questions as well. Okay, 3 hands raised, and oh, sorry, sorry. Okay, you were the first. Does he have to move to the microphone, or can we hear you?
Amelie, what do you say? Can you hear me?
Amelie, can you hear? Could you hear? Oh, you may say that.
There's one comment on the Kinjal method which you mentioned, and the novelty of that. It's really calling the Kinjal a hypersonic missile is a bit like spray painting stripes on my cat and calling it a tiger, because it doesn't really have the engine that goes with being hypersonic. Like if Kinjal is simply a maneuvering ballistic missile with a depressed trajectory that has a rocket engine, right? Whereas a real proper hypersonic missile, it has to have a scramjet engine in order for it to be hypersonic. So Kinjal is really, it's a bit fake, and they're calling it hypersonic to look futuristic and be cool, but it's not really that. And Delf's paper, I think it's fantastic how you make that link between carbon authoritarian. I think it's fantastic you bring in Hackett's paper, which is so unique in a way, and how you link that argument is beautiful. And I have my doubts about planetary realism and how new it is. Like in my PhD dissertation some years ago, I sort of had made a similar statement about Guimarães, like the Portuguese national poet, and his epic Os Lusíadas, where he basically there's this hero of the epic who is a Portuguese seafarer, and he like has different experiences that legitimize Portuguese colonialism. We're talking about the 16th century here. And in the end, he is shown by the angels a machine which represents like the planets and God, and everything is one machine working together. So I would say, like, I can send you the reference and everything. It's like that, I think, would be the first historical instance of planetary realism. And for your argument, it would have the charm that it's actually at the very beginning of European colonialism. So it works actually beautifully with the rest of your argument. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. So I think it's a good question.
Thank
you.
My name is André. I work at IFSH here in Hamburg. I have a similar point to Jochen's point on these aspects of the hypersonic missiles in your paper, but in a more general way. So it's a comment, I'm afraid, a short comment, I hope, another question, nonetheless. It seems to me that this third point actually is not on the same level as the other two, because the space dimension is not really there. You mentioned, Cornelia, you mentioned Kinjal. Kinjal has a flight trajectory of like 25 kilometers, but that's not really space. Zircon is an anti-ship missile. It's a cruise missile too, so it doesn't have really the altitude to have kind of space relation. But on the other hand, of course, I think you did mention this, the guiding systems, that could be a relevant here. But then the question is this relevant only for hypersonic missiles or just generally speaking for missiles? So this said, I think, at least from my view, it would be more interesting to look into something that might be part of the second factor you mentioned Starlink as an example. That is intelligence gathering and how the Ukraine is depending on the US, for example, because that's something that the Russians also officially mentioned as a huge problem. They didn't mention weapons, they mentioned the entire Western world, providing Ukraine with intelligence from satellites. And that goes beyond the Starlink example, because then it's more about communicating on the battlefield, while the other thing is more about, really hard, good intelligence for warfare. So, yeah, I'm going to leave it here. So I think this, for me, this was more interesting than the missile thing, because that's not to do understand the novelty here, right? Novelty is more the support we haven't seen before.
Okay, thanks a lot. Third question, Kai, and then sorry, I have to close the round of questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks so much for this panel. It was really, I learned a lot. The title Materialities, I think, was really quite apt because it felt really tangible what you did. I have a specific question to you, Delf. So I was really fascinated by your philosophical, what do you say, fresca?
Kaleidoscope.
Kaleidoscope, yeah. And I would be curious about, so what is your take on it? Because you had the Chandlerism, you had the Groveism, the Eurocene, and that is some capital scene sort of implicitly. What is the Rotheism in the study of climate and security? Because I guess we could need that in German IR.
So thanks a lot. I think we have a lot on the table now. And I would like to give the presenters the opportunity to react on the comments and questions. I would say 1 minute, 30 seconds. So if we start in the reverse order, Amelie, you would be first then.
Okay, sure. Thank you for the comments. About two comments I would like to address. The idea of who should we integrate in scientific communication more? Is it just IR, or is it also other like comparative politics? I think what I try to aim at my paper is to say we are too exclusive in the fields, but also the voices that we incorporate in the field. So I guess it's both. It's about incorporating more diverse voices in IR, but it's also bringing in other fields to increase our understanding and more broadly speaking. I mean, I'm someone who's transdisciplinary, so I would say that this is also something that I'm personally interested in. And then about the scientific council, and if we had a council like that, would it be able to veto political decision making? And how should be decided who should be on that council? I only know the SAGE Council here in the UK, which is kind of a permanent scientific council on certain issues. They cannot dictate political decision making, they can only inform it. But what I find interesting is that politicians have to basically sign off that they saw the scientific decisions and kind of estimates. So no one can say they didn't know about the consequences of what they actually decided to do in the end. which I think is a very interesting perspective, because no politician can be an expert in everything. I don't think we should expect them to, but I think we can expect that they make decisions not based on whim or on interest, but based on scientific opinion as well.
So thanks a lot. So Delf, you would be next.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, many thanks for these very helpful questions and comments. I think some of them are just recommendations and to advance the paper. And I agree with your observation that there are probably two papers. And I started with this more empirical paper when I submitted the abstract that draws on some of the discussion we had here in the cluster practical. Which was left Goethe, André, and others, where after the war started, we established like this working group on Ukraine war and climate change. And so this abstract and more empirical oriented paper that you found in there, that's very much emerged out of that discussion. Yeah, the cluster. And then I when I sat down and wrote the paper, I thought, wow, this is rather boring. I want to, theorize it. So, and then I went and read through this and reread some of the literature. I think in terms of original contribution, I really think that especially Gyrotics and Carthage's work really have something to offer to make sense of the Ukraine war. And obviously, that would have to be filled with much more empirics, but it's really important, especially the pieces. Fits so well, and I found it surprising that there's so few literature actually on these matters in the Russian case. Maybe it's not in English. Maybe it's a linguistic problem, but I couldn't find much literature actually establishing them. So I think it's really important and something to follow up. And maybe the other points very also I very much agree that there is a much longer genealogy of this kind of and actually have to come just send me the paper would be appreciated. I think it's focused on Africa. Yes, Yemen and Syria. I mean, the systematic review by Adam Sedal was published in 2018. I think this will change considerably afterwards because a lot of papers were published on Syria and Yemen, which weren't included in the systemic review. I think that's probably the reason. And then, so what's my own take? I mean, yes, in this paper, I take more like a meta perspective. I mean, in my previous DFE project, I think my move would be to move from what one could call like a normative philosophical posthumanism, like how do we extend security towards the non-human world and the entire Earth system to a more analytical posthumanism in the sense of, okay, how are non-human actors mobilized in security projects, including, satellites, AI, and different kinds of technologies, for example, and then study these sort of security projects in a more empirical way, drawing on STS and critical security literature. But I think but I'm also very much in line with the growth take of the anchors and so on. And that's and materiality is really important in these perspectives as well. So
since we're running out of time, could you just briefly?
Yes, thanks for the comment, André. As for the second, there's nothing methodologically innovative here. You need to use the methodologies that the different perspectives use anyway, and then bring them into useful conversations. The other question, space as an idea versus space as political construction. Political constructions draw on ideas, but they go beyond that, and in that they're expressed in objects, in institutions, in performances, and practices. So think of border assemblages, rituals of crossing borders, things of policies demonstrate control through administration, through taxation, policing, and the like. So the state is more than just language.
More questions? Thanks a lot for your comments. As I said, it's work in progress. So the definitions, they will definitely come in. And maybe I want to address one of the aspects. How is it new that new state actors are in space? And here we see something new in the last year. We had space as a military dimension, a state military dimension in the Cold War times. Still, we had the interaction with non-state actors, but they had been working for these state agencies, which were using space. And then we had economic applications like GPS, which comes out of the military, going to be the economic sphere. What we see now is that we have this outer space, space. It's a critical sphere. It's crucial for enabling these new technologies. And we see here now is this new space. It's really called new space. Like we have commercial actors with their own agendas, which are actually independent of space. Only space, just space. Then 10,000 of satellites in the lower orbit. So we have really a game-changing in the usage of space. With regard to the questions, thanks a lot. So yes, Kinjal, it is. We have different type of hypersonic weapons, and so Kinjal is not a hypersonic glide missile. It's a but still, it has the characteristics that defines hypersonic weapons, and it is nevertheless in literature and also in military analysis, it is included in this category. That's why I also mentioned it. So the other questions, the intelligence gathering to warfare, it is also mentioned. There are some other aspects that are mentioned in the paper. I just shortened up for the presentation. So it is also addressed in the paper in short, but you're right, it's a very interesting aspect. It should be broadened. And that's what I mentioned with Ukraine as a non-space country, which is completely dependent on the space assets from other countries for communication and for warfare. To be very, very important.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the inspiring presentations and also for your papers. I enjoyed reading them, and I would encourage you, if you haven't done yet, to upload them so that the other people can also read them. Because although they might be short and not completed, but they're very inspiring. And as since I started with reminding us that we already had a debate on a turning point 3 decades ago in IR, and this, I would like to give you my impression of what we were talking about in this panel, and maybe you already did it yesterday and in last night's panel as well. 3 decades ago, our "What did we miss?" started an epistemological debate, and paved the floor for more reflexive or post-positivist approaches on thinking about in IR. And I had the feeling with, not only because we were talking about the materialities, but we are talking, when we ask ourselves what did we miss, about the age of complexity in our answers, to say, it's a debate on a more ontological level, and our answer is to say add more bits and pieces, and then look how we can research it methodologically in a maybe novel way, or use the existing methodologies in different ways. And I think this is a quite interesting observation for someone like me, who has lived through some debates in our discipline, so to speak. So with this, thank you very much. I would like to close the panel and hope we have other lively debates during the day. I invite you to the panel on feminist approaches because I will talk on masculinity and hypermasculinity. So maybe we'll see each other again in the afternoon. So thanks a lot. Bye.